Okay, can everyone see that okay?
You don't have any feedback.
Annie?
You're good, Angela. I can see it.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I'm Bob Engels, Angela Sainer. I guess I want to begin by paraphrasing Sir Isaac Newton and saying the reason we can see farther now is because we're standing on the shoulders of giants. There's been a tremendous amount of work done by many others who are a lot smarter than me and whose work we've used to design and build this course. I think it's apt to paraphrase Isaac Newton here because he so eloquently used and developed mathematics to represent his laws of motion. One of our goal in developing this course was not only to combine the physics and the math, but also to incorporate techniques that both increase the engagement of our students and the rigor of the content. The techniques we used came from both math and science educational research and some of our own experiences in teaching. And rather than telling students what we want them to learn, we see our job as placing experiences along the path of students so that they can discover it on their own. And hopefully these experiences will encourage them to collaborate, communicate, problem solve, and think critically. And we're in a process right here. We're still building and working on this. So our work is ongoing, and we're constantly discovering new ideas and ways to improve our delivery of the content. So we're kind of engineering this at all times. And that's where we're working. So we thought we'd start with why physics first. And I don't know if you guys remember taking science. You probably do better than I. But this is the kind of, when we took biology first, which I think started back in 1890, some people made a decision, biology, chemistry, physics. And I think one of the reasons physics was done later is because students don't have the prerequisite math skills to be able to do physics. So we feed them biology. And if you look at this slide here, this is the stuff that's in a biology book for a 9th grader. So I see physics and chemistry in there. And so how is a 9th grader supposed to understand this without any knowledge of chemistry or physics? So it makes sense to us that physics is the foundation of all sciences and you need physics to understand chemistry, and you need physics and chemistry to understand biology. So in this case, it also makes science something that students do rather than memorize. If you're given something like a diagram like this, you really can't understand it. So all you can do is really memorize it. And I don't know about you, but I think from my experience here is that a lot of students are turned off by science because you give them this very thick book and they have to go memorize it. And if that's what science is about, I don't know about a lot of people, but many of us are like, I don't want to have anything to do with it. And another cool thing about doing this first is it levels the playing field for our students. It's not only those that have become good at studying and being able to memorize to get good grades. We've taken that out of the equation. Now it's about doing, and we can get more students to believe that they can be good at this because it's not just about memorizing.
So that's a little bit about why physics first. As to why we chose to do physics and Algebra 2 together, well, in our school system, our honors kids come in at an Algebra 2 level. Looking at that, we decided honors level kids could be our guinea pigs, a little bit safer. We couldn't mess them up as bad maybe as some of the other kids. If this completely went south, which thankfully it hasn't. They've also taken the Algebra 1 in middle school. So coming in with that Algebra 1 foundation and now coming into the Algebra 2 content, seemed like that was the best choice for us. We also thought these are the kids that are most likely going to be interested in STEM careers. Not all of them, but the majority of them, because when you're good at something, typically that's something you like to do. Then the last thing that we really considered too when we thought about this was the mobility. We have the ability to take content that is typically taught in a pre-calc class and move it into the Algebra 2. For example, we teach the kids vectors in this class because there's vectors all throughout physics. Vectors is not part of the Algebra 2 content, it's part of the pre-calc, but I'm able to work closely with the pre-calc teacher at our school system and kind of switch some of those things as to where they are because it makes more sense to do that within this program. So that's a little bit about why the Algebra 2.
All right, so we thought, why would we combine these two together? I think math supports physics and physics supports math. So Why wouldn't we do it? And to me, math is the language of science, especially the science of, or the language of physics. So why be in separate silos? Since I've come into teaching, the math department's been over here doing their thing, and occasionally we get together and say, could you do this to help us, or could you do that to help us? But why not do it together and work together? In physics, math is our language. It's our tool that we can represent natural phenomenon, especially through graphs and equations and developing those things. So it helps to me, it would make sense because it makes the math less abstract. One way you can look at it is in math, I saw us learning how to use a hammer, learning how to use a saw, learning how to use a tool by tool, that we never got to really build something with it. And in the physics, we're learning about the tools, and then we're taking those tools and building something with it so they can see how it's being used. I don't know about you, but if you've taught physics before, we spend a lot of time teaching math because they don't remember the math or they weren't sure what to do with it. I looked at, when I first started thinking about putting this course together, I was looking at physics first curriculums out there, and what I saw was they were very math light because we were expecting ninth graders without any math. So I thought, well, rather than do that, if we brought the math in, we don't have to make it math light, and we can make this course it's a double period course, or for us it's a full block. And last but not least, and all of this is we're trying to foster interest in STEM and getting people to believe that they can do it. So that's why I thought about combining it. Angela?
I would say from a math perspective, when Bob approached me about creating this course together and doing all of this, the biggest thing that I thought about was retention, which has been an issue for a long time in a lot of our classes. And one of the hopes was that by creating a course where these kids can have a deeper connection to those tools that he alluded to, and putting it all together and making it more meaningful and creating realistic and relatable context to answer that question that they always ask us, which is, why in the world are we learning this, without them even having to ask the question, which thankfully they don't in this course because they see the usefulness of it. So hopefully those deeper connections and the fact that they see that usefulness is going to help with the retention and help those kids stop asking that question, which so far it's working. So we talked a little bit about, as we were trying to prepare this presentation, what do we think, like teachers especially that are listening, are going to want to know? And the collaboration piece of this we thought was kind of a big deal. As with anything that you pursue in life, there's always going to be some good and bad, some challenges and some rewards. I will say, in my estimation, our biggest challenge is time. Creating the curriculum and creating meaningful lessons, finding time to meet with each other. We are fortunate that we have had a planning period in common both years that we've done this, or I guess this is the third year that we've done this. We also have a very supportive principal who happened to be a math teacher that's given us some release time, but having that time to actually create activities to help the students discover the connections between our two content areas is extremely important. And it's also extremely rewarding, but time consuming. So time is a big challenge. I know one thing that we've had success in is working with shared drives and shared documents so that we can work from home or on the weekends to create some of these things that we really just don't have the time to do during the school day, since we both teach a full load of other classes too. But the benefits way outweigh any kind of challenges that we've seen, both for us and for our students, making it well worth the experience right now. The professional growth, I think, is a huge piece of it. You know, coming in and collaborating like we do, we have two very different perspectives and two very different personalities, which is kind of fun, I think, for the kids and for us. I think the longer we teach together, the more we get each other's rhythms and the better it gets. We both have our strengths and weaknesses. And I like to think we balance each other out on some level. As teachers, we're used to kind of running our own shows in our own classrooms. We both have had to learn to let go a little bit, which is a challenge, but worth it. Because in that process of letting go, I think that Bob would agree, we both have learned a lot from each other. Through that constant collaboration, though, as he mentioned, you know, we used to be across the hall from each other, and, you know, you'd talk to each other in passing or in between hallway class changes and things. Being in the same room and being able to teach together, truly co-teach, has created a situation where we noticed even like subtle differences in things, like how if you look at a math text and a science text, the same kind of content is verbalized with very different language that we never really would have noticed had we not been teaching together. And if we, as we try to communicate these things and teach together, are noticing that and getting confused by it, think about how your students are feeling. And our students are feeling very isolated in those silos too. Science is here and math is here. So that's one of the biggest benefits that I've seen is we're able to kind of mirror those things or put those things together and combine those so that hopefully we can help those students not be so confused by the differences in the language. This experience also gives us the ability to be learners instead of just teachers. You know, when I'm watching Bob teach something in physics that maybe I don't remember or I haven't learned before, I become the student and I'm able to give him feedback on things and vice versa. When I'm teaching the math and it's something he hasn't done in a while, he can be the student and kind of give me feedback on, you know what, maybe if we try it this way. And that I think has really been beneficial for us too. You know, our goal within this class is to create more meaningful tasks and activities as we go through this because we want to develop those thinkers that we need the students to be. So to that end, a little bit about, and I'm sure you've seen this slide many times, standards for mathematical practices and the 21st century skills. Earlier, Bob spoke about rigor, and we want this class to be rigorous. And I know Annie in the opening kind of talked about what that means in the context of the ODE and what we've decided is rigorous. And really, it boils down to creating students that are going to be thinkers. One of the things that I think was most powerful to me was some training that I went through, professional development I went through the Ohio Department of Ed, where we talked about we're not teaching them content. We're using the content to teach them to be critical thinkers. And that's really what we focus on. The content is a tool that we're using also, but these skills, these 21st century skills and these standards for math practice are what we really want the kids to walk out of here being able to do. So, you know, we're hoping that when students think about mathematics in, you know, relatable and interesting contexts, that they develop that intuition behind the principles and formulas of mathematics. And that intuition is going to help them to think about things and problem solve, hopefully in new and unique situations, which is what we want when we talk about having a high degree of rigor. With that goal of creating thinkers in mind, I'm going to let Bob talk a little bit about how we constructed the curriculum for this course.
All right. So I don't know if anybody's heard about physics modeling. I understand it's a math thing, but it was a thing started back in the early 90s, a new technique of teaching where we were teaching science as science is done. So they're using a lot of inductive reasoning, and we're having the students build models of that would represent their observations. And when we think of models here, we're thinking of representations of natural phenomena, and they can build those models in terms of words, diagrams, eventually graphs, and from those graphs, equations. And so I took there's a lot of physics modeling instruction out there, curriculum. And we started by taking the different units of the physics and kind of made a skeleton out of that. And from there, we saw where and then matched that up to the Ohio State physics standards, and then matched up where they met and supported the physics, or the math supported or met the physics content. And then we saw all that, and then we saw that we weren't always meeting everything. You know, there was some math standing out there. So we went back to modeling instruction, looked at other content areas and different places in there, and modified or added other units to it so we could include as much as the Algebra 2 content as possible. And we weren't quite successful in getting all the Algebra 2 content to match up somewhere. So when we couldn't do that, we had to create a standalone math unit. And so I let math units in there, so we have some of those lessons. And besides using this physics modeling instruction, like we said before, we've used a lot of the educational research-based stuff. So Angela had been working with the mathematical modeling and reasoning and advanced quantitative reasoning pilot. And we saw some really cool stuff in there. So we've been taking a lot of those ideas, or some of those ideas, and incorporating them in there in the math. Like we saw cool stuff, for example, out of proportional reasoning and dimensional analysis. So it's so that's kind of how we built it. We started with the physics, we matched the math, then we tried to get more physics, or it didn't match the math, and we put that in there. And we're using those techniques there to do those sort of things.
So here's an idea of our scope and sequence right now. I will tell you, I think there were 24 units over the summer when we were working on this. Every year this has changed. As Bob said, this is a fluid thing. It's constantly changing, and we're constantly reevaluating pretty much every single day. We were teaching today, and I was like, oh, maybe we should move this sooner. Do you think we should move that later? We're seeing, as we get to know each other's content better, where things fit and how we can pull things in that we didn't even realize we could pull in originally when we went through this. So as he described, these green units are the ones where we have completely integrated the curriculum. So there is the Honors Algebra 2, the Algebra 2 curriculum is built into all those units. The red ones or maroon ones that you see are the only ones where there's no physics in there. It's just straight pure math. And even within that, like the polynomials, we do a roller coaster project, which does involve some physics. We're just not teaching them anything new with the physics. So that's why that one's in red. So
yeah, so you can see roughly 2/3 of the course is physics and math fully integrated, and about 1/3 of it we can't find fit. And we may be able to find fit, as Angela said, as we go on.
Every year it gets a little better.
Yeah. All right.
Oh, sorry.
So we're going to talk a little bit about how one of our units that we've developed and how we mix in the math, the Algebra 2 content with the physics. This one is where we're developing a balanced force model. And so the kids by this time have learned about one-dimensional vectors when we've been talking about one-dimensional motion. And they understand a vector as something that has a quantity and a direction, where the arrow points in the direction of the quantity, or wherever it has a direction, and the length of the arrow represents how much there's, the magnitude of it. And they understand if two of them are pointing in the same direction, they add together, and if they're pointing in opposite directions, they subtract. And they learned that in there as learning about things, distinguishing between something called distance and displacement in physics, where distance is the path length of something, how far it's traveled that way, and displacement is how far something is from where it started and in what direction. So at this point, we introduced the math to them right now. We said, well, what happens if we move in 2 dimensions? So you can see on the left on that slide, what if we walked 4 meters north and 3 meters right? The kids can easily find the distance and say, well, we walked 7 meters. You know what I mean? That was our distance. But then we asked them the question, well, what's the displacement? How far are you from where you started? And they can see that, and what direction is that? So at that point, they start to learn about using head to tail addition of that. And we start with graph paper and ask them to use rulers and protractors to figure out the angle and the distance at that point. At some point there, we ask them if there's an easier way, a more accurate way we could find side lengths and angles. Most of the kids we've had in our class, they come from a lot of different schools and math backgrounds, but most of them should have seen the Pythagorean theorem and been through those proofs in 8th grade or something. And most of them can say, oh yeah, Pythagorean theorem, we could figure out what that red vector length is, the hypotenuse length in there. And then the next question to them is, well, what about the angle? Is there a way we could figure out the angle without having to use a protractor and very carefully draw these on graph paper? At that point, we say we let them start to discover patterns of relationships between acute angles to side length ratios and similar right triangles. And we let them discover those things. And then once they recognize these patterns, which is what a lot of what we're doing in math and physics is looking for patterns. And once we find that pattern, they realize they can start to make predictions. So then we start to introduce, and they notice that the ratio of lengths of sides to a certain angle is always constant. So at that point, we said, well, we actually give those names of those ratios to certain sides, these funny names like cosine, sine, tangent, and they actually just are talking about a ratio of lengths of sides. At that point, they realize, oh, we can predict angles by doing inverses, and we can predict a ratio of sides, or if no angles, we can actually predict the ratio of sides without just knowing a couple things. So it's pretty cool. And then we go into talking about balanced forces. And if you have a balanced force the forces are balanced acting on an object, the vector sum is 0. So we first start off, and this is where the physics curriculum for physics first would be light. They're only going to give them vectors that are 90 degrees to each other, so we can add or subtract this way and that way, and always something cancels out, and they really don't have to do any trig. But in this case, like looking at the bear on the right going up, standing on this 17-degree slope, they can start to draw. They understand forces by now, and they can figure out that there's 3 forces acting on this bear, and those 3 forces have to add up to 0. And lo and behold, it makes, when they draw it out, it makes a right triangle, 2 of those forces. And so from there, if they know the hypotenuse length, which is they know how to compute the force of gravity on something, they can start to figure out what these things are, normal forces and frictional forces. We also use interactive simulations. I don't know if you've seen those on PhET. They do a lot now for math. They started out on the physics side, but they do a lot of them. They can actually visualize 2D vector addition in there. And learned by reading some other research, we don't introduce vector components till later on in the course. I think it's been shown that students can pick up, and it's much more intuitive to them than to add vectors directly like that without components. So once they have a firm grasp on that, going to components in a unit like unbalanced forces, where the vector sum is a non-zero, it starts to make a lot more sense to them, rather than having them just mimic what we're doing up here.
And in this lesson, just like other lessons that as we try and develop them, the goal is to develop the need and have the students see the need for the math, and then even maybe stress and struggle with not having a tool in the form of a math equation or a mathematical formula, and then develop the formula from it, which is, I think, different from how typically we do in a math classroom. Typically, we hand them a formula, show them how to use it, and then at the end, maybe we say like, hey, let's try a word problem. We're trying to flip that script and start with, hey, we've got a need, can we find something to fill it? And that's been a really rewarding process. All right, sorry. So pathways after HAPS. The typical pathway would be to go in our school to honors geometry. Some of these kids have already taken geometry because they are accelerated 2 years in their grade school. So some of those kids will go straight to honors pre-calc. We've also accelerated some kids that really, like the top 10% of the class, maybe a few more than that last year, that did so well with the Algebra 2 and they had the maturity. We accelerated them. They had an interest in being in STEM, engineering, into the pre-calc as sophomores. They could take the geometry and pre-calc concurrently, or they could just go straight to pre-calc and pick up the geometry later, or do a self-taught on the geometry. That gives them the ability to take AP Calculus as juniors and then Calc BC as seniors if they would choose to. And again, those are just for our most accelerated students. Not everybody chooses that pathway. I would say our first year doing this, one of our top students said, I'm going to be a doctor. I don't really need to do that, so I'm going to pass, which is fine. It's just there as an option. You'll be surprised.
They have to take calculus-based physics to go to med school.
All right. So she's going to be taking Calc next year, so she'll at least have Calc AB. They could also take AP Statistics. They could go into a CCP trig class or other CCP math courses, or they could even go, you know what, this whole STEM thing is not necessarily for me, and change and go to another Algebra 2 equivalency course. So again, like Annie talked about in the introductory phase, we're creating pathways and giving these kids options. And it's based on their interest and, you know, what they're looking to do as a career.
Another thing, the pathways for, I don't know if you're interested in science, but of course we're doing the physics, and then they're going to chemistry, and then bio as a junior. And then hopefully the idea is to get these HAPS kids, these honors algebra 2 and physics kids to feel great about going into a calculus-based physics. So they would take calculus physics, AP physics C mechanics the first semester, and then take AP physics C electricity and magnetics the second semester. So, and if they didn't take calculus as a junior, they can still take calculus concurrently with those physics courses. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where we're going on that.
I see we're running a little short on time, so I'm going to kind of skip through this slide. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. I just gave you a visual of how many students we've had, typically 53 to 57, and we do have 2 sections of this class. And then where they are now, most of them, like you see, are in pre-calc or geometry, and some of the other courses we talked about. The next steps, as we've talked about it, are to change it from just being at the honors level, but also to move it into the CP level and make this accessible for all the students that we have here. And to that end, the science department has already changed the curriculum for the college prep level students here, and they all started this year with physics as their first course also. So all the freshmen and the college prep level are also taking physics. And it's not a combined class, but our Algebra 1 teacher and our physics teachers are collaborating with each other as they go through that process. And like Mr. Engels was just talking about, I know, Mr. Engels, when do I ever call you that? It's also hopefully leading them into that calc-based physics C as they get older.
Our goal is to try to get the administration to blend these two courses together. Scheduling is always a problem, but good stuff is hard to do. We have rigor also for us as teachers.
Mm-hmm. And the more collaboration we do, I know we talked about this earlier, not teaching in silos. I'm excited about that, to have more people in the math department working with more people in the science department. I think that benefits the teachers as well as the students. I did want to throw up some pictures here of just kind of what it looks like to be in our class. So what you're seeing here is a pendulum lab that we did, where students had to measure and find values and data about a pendulum that they kind of created. And then we went outside, and you can see Mr. Engels in that big picture there dropped a bowling ball down, and they had to figure out how tall the rope was, how long the rope was, based on, and we didn't tell them anything. We just said, figure out how long this is. And it sometimes took a little while, but they finally figured out it related back to that lab we did a few days ago and the equations that they had, and they were able to model, which was exciting to watch.
It's fun to watch.
Mm-hmm. This is just another example of another activity we've done, the Paw Patrol drop. And again, you can see students working on whiteboards and working in groups, which is a lot of what we do.
So the Paw Patrol is, they have a Paw Patrol puppet that's on the ceiling that they can set a laser switch on the floor. So they have a constant velocity cart with a bowl in it that triggers that switch and makes the Paw Patrol puppet drop, and you have something accelerating coming downwards and a cart going with constant velocity, and their goal is to figure out where those two meet. So they have a quadratic equation and a linear equation, and they have to figure out where those two meet and make that Paw Patrol drop right in the bowl of the that's on top of that constant velocity toy car.
And I believe these will be available, but this is an example of a group doing that. And I personally like that video a lot, just because I think it kind of highlights exactly why we're doing this, which is the excitement that the kids have as they're working through and solving these problems. It's very rewarding for us. So that is our presentation. On this last little slide, we did do some questioning of our students to ask them for some feedback. I don't expect you to sit there and read it all, but I know she'll be posting this recording up and everything else. And if you have a minute and you're not sure whether this is a good idea or anything else, I mean, I figured the student thoughts on how they feel about this course, and this is kids that are in it this year, last year, and the year before, so all 3 years. And it was heartwarming for me to read some of these. It was pretty cool to see what they thought.
Yes.
So thank you for joining us. I know we had hoped to have some question and answer time, but there we go. Feel free to contact us if you have questions later on. I will be honest, Bob's much better about answering email than I am. So you might want to contact him, but contact either one of us if you have more questions, and we'll be happy to share what we know. Good luck.
Okay. Thank you, Angela.